A white woman refuses to sit next to a black man in first class, not knowing that he is the CEO of the airline. Days later, the woman discovers that her father, who passed away many years ago, is none other than. Adela nervously adjusted the strap of her designer bag as the flight attendant, with a professional smile, indicated her seat in first class. Her heels made a soft sound on the cabin's carpet as she walked with steady steps, but her thoughts were far from calm. Today would be a long day. Her agenda in the city she was visiting was filled with social meetings and commitments that she mostly despised, but they were part of the role she had to play. When she reached her seat, her body immediately tensed. The man seated by the window, with a relaxed posture and seemingly focused on his tablet, was black. Adela felt an instinctive discomfort. She wasn't openly racist, at least that's what she kept telling herself, but the exclusive atmosphere of first class was a space she associated with people like her, and this man clearly didn't fit that preconceived idea. Hiding her discomfort, she sat down with an almost inaudible sigh, hoping the flight would pass without incident. She pulled a magazine from her bag and opened it, though she couldn't help but glance furtively at her seatmate. Who is he? She wondered as she stole glances at him. He was dressed in an expensive suit, but that didn't entirely convince her. Probably some local businessman who made his fortune quickly, she concluded in her mind. Only a few minutes had passed when the man slightly turned his head toward her and greeted her with a deep, confident voice. "Good afternoon. My name is Amancio," he said, extending his hand with a polite smile. Adela, surprised by the friendly and professional tone, hesitated before shaking his hand with barely disguised coldness. "Adela," she replied in a curt tone, without looking up from her magazine. She knew she was being rude, but she couldn't help it. These kinds of situations made her uncomfortable. She preferred silence and distance. Amancio returned his attention to his tablet, showing no sign of being offended, as if he were used to that kind of reaction. He continued working, reviewing financial charts and urgent emails from his executive team. While he did this, he couldn't help but notice the uncomfortable glances from his seatmate. He had learned to deal with that kind of prejudice from a young age, but in his current position, those moments irritated him more than ever. The plane began taxiing slowly toward the runway, and Adela tried to relax, but thoughts about Amancio kept invading her mind. Finally, she could no longer resist her curiosity. "Are you traveling for business?" she asked, without looking away from the window, her voice laced with formality. Amancio looked up, clearly surprised by the question after the awkward silence they had shared. "Yes," he replied with a slight smile. "I have an important meeting tomorrow. And you? For pleasure or work?" Adela sighed, as if the question had forced her out of her bubble of discomfort. "Work, in a way. Family matters," she said vaguely, avoiding going into detail. She knew her private life, filled with commitments to her husband and the political connections he cultivated, wasn't the type of information she would share with a stranger. Family matters? Amancio observed her with a raised eyebrow, detecting some tension in her response. "I hope it's nothing complicated," Adela smiled, but without warmth. "Complications are inevitable when it comes to politics," she responded, hinting at her connection to important figures without being too direct. Part of her enjoyed that game of ambiguity. Her name and surname usually opened doors and commanded respect, but she doubted this man knew who she really was. Amancio nodded in understanding. "Politics always is. My family has had its share of complications too." Adela couldn't help but frown at that response. Something in Amancio's tone suggested a deeper story, but she preferred not to ask. She didn't want to start a conversation that might result in an uncomfortable closeness. The flight had reached cruising altitude when a flight attendant appeared with drinks. Amancio ordered a whiskey, and Adela, after a brief pause, opted for a white wine. She took her time sipping slowly, using the glass as an excuse to avoid further conversation. After a few minutes of silence, Amancio decided to break the tension that seemed to float between them. "I have to admit, I travel a lot for work, but this flight is special for me," he commented, without taking his eyes off his drink. Adela looked at him, puzzled. "Special? Why do you say that?" "It's the first time in a long while that I've flown on one of my own planes," he said with a slight smile. Adela blinked, confused. "Your own planes?" Amancio nodded. "I'm the CEO of this airline. This flight is part of my usual schedule, but it's special because today, I'm here not as an executive, but as a passenger." The impact of his words hit Adela like a wave. She felt her face tense, and her mind began processing what she had just heard. This man, whom she had judged so quickly, wasn't just any passenger, but the head of the very airline they were flying on. You're the CEO?" she murmured, unable to hide the surprise in her tone. Amancio let out a small laugh, not with superiority, but with the calm of someone used to that reaction. "Yes, I am. The company has grown a lot in recent years. It's been a long and difficult journey, but here we are." Adela felt a mix of embarrassment and curiosity washing over her. She couldn't help but look at Amancio with new eyes, trying to reconcile this new information with the image she had formed of him. How could she have been so superficial? "Wow, that's impressive," she finally said, trying to maintain her composure. "It's not what I expected." Amancio looked at her with an enigmatic expression. "Sometimes, things aren't what they seem." The silence that followed was even heavier. Adela turned to the window, trying to pull herself together. But inside, the questions kept spinning. Who really was this man? And why did she feel there was more to this story than Amancio had told her? As the plane continued its course, both sank into their own thoughts. Without Adela knowing, this flight would not only change her perception of Amancio, but also how she viewed her own life. The truth she was about to discover would shake her to her core. Adela couldn't stop thinking about Amancio's words. The airline's CEO. She had made the mistake of judging him within seconds, based solely on his appearance. As the plane continued its path through the clouds, something inside her began to crack. Throughout her life, she had always been confident in her place in the world, but now, the discomfort of that seat seemed to extend to her entire existence. She took another sip of wine, trying to stay calm, but the bitter taste did little to soothe her. Beside her, Amancio remained calm, focused on his tablet, as if he hadn't noticed the emotional storm he had stirred in her. "Why is this affecting me so much?" Adela thought as she looked out the window, trying to find an answer in the cloudy landscape. Finally, unable to contain herself any longer, she broke the silence with a question that had been circling in her mind since Amancio revealed his identity. "It must have been hard to get where you are," she commented, her voice softer than usual. This time, there was no trace of the coldness with which she had treated him before. It was a genuine question, born out of a mix of curiosity and respect. Amancio lifted his gaze from his tablet and observed her for a moment. His stare was deep, as if he were weighing how much of his story he would share with her. After a few seconds, he nodded. "It was," he replied, his voice carrying an unexpected weight. "I had to overcome a lot of things that people in my position don't usually face. And not just because of the color of my skin, though that, of course, played a significant role." Adela noticed a slight sadness in his tone, something she hadn't detected before. This man wasn't just a successful executive. He had fought to get there, and every word he spoke seemed to carry the invisible scars of that battle. What was the hardest part? Adela surprised herself by asking. It wasn't like her to show interest in others' lives, much less someone she had just met. But there was something about Amancio that intrigued her, that pushed her to want to know more. Amancio set his tablet aside and leaned back in his seat, as if preparing to talk about something deep. His eyes, which had maintained an almost impenetrable calm until that moment, now showed a slight storm of emotions. The hardest part was accepting that, no matter how hard you try, there will always be people who judge you without knowing you. Sometimes it's because of your appearance, sometimes your background. I grew up hearing stories about how my life was supposed to be, about the expectations others had for me. But I never wanted to settle for what others thought I could achieve. Adela listened intently, feeling a pang in her heart. There was something in his words that connected to her own reality. Her life, too, had been shaped by the expectations of others, though in her case, those expectations came from wealth and politics. Her parents, her husband, the society she lived in, they all expected her to fulfill a specific role, but now, she felt all of that was starting to unravel. Amancio continued, his voice lowering slightly, as if he were speaking more to himself than to her. My mother, she was always a strong woman, but she suffered a lot, too. She was of African descent and had a relationship with a powerful man, someone who never took responsibility for what happened between them. He left my mother and me alone while he continued his life, building another family, building an empire at the cost of his own integrity. Adela felt a chill run down her spine. Amancio's story began to resonate within her in a disturbing way, as if something dark and forgotten was being unearthed in her mind. She forced herself to remain calm, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together in an unsettling way. Your father was never in your life? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady, but there was a slight tremor she couldn't control. No, Amancio replied, with a bitter tone. He was a man who only sought power. The relationship with my mother was clandestine, something he would never admit publicly. He didn't want to tarnish his name or reputation, so he left my mother and me in the shadows while he rose politically. My mother died without ever seeing him take responsibility for what he had done. Adela felt as if the air in the cabin had become thicker. That story, something about it seemed familiar, too familiar. She remained silent, biting her lip as her mind drifted back to buried memories of her childhood, of half-heard conversations in her living room, where her father, an influential politician, spoke in low tones with her mother about certain matters. Amancio, she began to say, but the words caught in her throat. It couldn't be, could it? Amancio looked at her intently, and for the first time since they had met, his expression showed something beyond professional calm. There was a mix of restrained anger and sadness, something he had learned to hide for years, but that was now beginning to surface. What's going on, Adela? He asked, his tone serious, as if sensing she was about to say something important. Adela took a deep breath. The words that came out of her mouth surprised both her and him. I think I know who your father is. Amancio looked at her with a new intensity, his body tensing slightly at Adela's confession. The plane cabin, despite being full of people, seemed to have shrunk to just the two of them. The silence between them grew thick, almost palpable. My father, Adela continued, her hands trembling slightly as she placed them on her lap. He was a powerful politician, and I know he had a relationship with an Afro-descendant woman many years ago. We never talked about it at home, but I heard enough to know that he didn't take responsibility for what happened. Amancio's eyes narrowed, as if he were analyzing every word, every movement of Adela. What was your father's name? Adela felt the world around her spinning faster than she could control. But she knew there was no turning back now. Not anymore. Arturo Monterreal, she whispered. The name fell between them like a stone in a lake, creating ripples that changed everything. Amancio remained still for a moment, as if processing what he had just heard. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, filled with an anger that had been buried for years. Arturo Monterreal, he repeated. That name is the one that has haunted my entire life. He's the man who destroyed my mother. He is my father. Adela froze, unable to find words. Everything she thought she knew about her life, about her family, was crumbling. The man sitting next to her, the man she had so quickly judged, turned out to be her half-brother, the son of her father's dark past. And as the plane continued its journey, Adela knew that this trip was no longer just a business flight. It was the beginning of a truth that would change their lives forever. The plane seemed suspended in an unreal silence. Adela sat still, as if the entire world had stopped with the revelation she had just made. She couldn't believe what had just come out of her mouth, nor the consequences of having uttered that name, so forbidden in her family. Amancio said nothing at first. He just watched her, studying every feature of her face, trying to reconcile the image of this high society woman with the painful legacy they shared. His gaze hardened, and the tension between them became almost unbearable. Adela's words had stirred something deep inside him, something he had tried to bury his entire life. So, you're Arturo Monterreal's daughter, Amancio finally murmured, his voice filled with restrained resentment. Adela nodded slowly, unable to meet his gaze any longer. She felt a mixture of shame and confusion. She had never wanted to confront this kind of reality, and now here she was, sitting next to the man who was the product of her father's greatest mistake. "Did you know what he did?" Amancio asked, his tone sharp. It was a question laden with anger, but also deep sadness. Adela swallowed hard, feeling the words catch in her throat. "I knew my father had affairs," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I knew there was a woman, but I never knew more than that. My mother never spoke of it openly, and I never asked." Amancio let out a bitter laugh. "Of course, the luxury of ignorance. While my mother struggled alone, your family continued living in their bubble of privilege. To you, it was just an inconvenient rumor. To me, it was reality." The weight of his words hit Adela hard. She knew he was right, and that made the shame even more unbearable. She had always lived in a gilded cage, isolated from the consequences of her father's decisions. But now, she was facing those consequences in a way she could never have imagined. "Amancio, she began, but he cut her off. "What?" The hardness in his voice silenced her instantly. "Are you going to apologize for your father's actions? Or do you just feel bad because now you know the truth?" Adela pressed her lips together, feeling her eyes fill with tears. She didn't know what to say. The emotions were overwhelming. She had been raised to maintain appearances, to keep up a facade of perfection, and now that facade was crumbling before her own eyes. Seeing her internal struggle, Amancio sighed and leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a moment, as if trying to regain control of his emotions. This wasn't the confrontation he had imagined his whole life. As a child, he had dreamed of the day he would face his father, the day he would demand justice for everything that had been done to him and his mother. But he had never imagined he would face the man's daughter, the daughter who was also a victim, though in a different way. "All this time," Amancio said, his voice softer now, but still full of pain, "I've lived with hatred for your father. My mother died with a broken heart, and he never took responsibility. And now, here I am, sitting next to you, his daughter, on a plane. It's ironic, don't you think?" Adela didn't know how to respond. Her thoughts were disorganized, chaotic. The only thing she knew was that Amancio's pain was real as her own. And though they came from different worlds, they now shared a bond that neither of them wanted. "I didn't really know what my father was like either," Adela confessed after a long silence. "He was always distant with me, and with my mother. Well, she always justified him, but I saw the cracks. I knew he wasn't the man everyone thought he was, but I never imagined the magnitude of what he had done. I never thought about the lives he destroyed." Amancio looked at her again, and this time there was something different in his gaze. It wasn't just resentment. There was a spark of understanding, a small opening to the possibility that Adela was suffering in her own way too. "And now what?" he asked, his tone less aggressive. "Are you going to go back to your life, pretending you don't know the truth? Are you going to keep being the perfect wife in a life of lies?" Amancio's question was like a punch to Adela's stomach. It was brutally honest, and though she didn't want to admit it, there was a part of her that wanted exactly that: to return to her life, ignore the truth, and pretend this encounter had never happened. But she knew she couldn't. Not after what she had discovered. "I don't know," she admitted, with a sincerity that surprised even her. "I don't know what to do. Everything I believed about my life, about my family, it's all falling apart. My father, my husband, everything feels like a lie now." Amancio watched her in silence for a few moments. He knew what it was like to live with a truth that consumes you from the inside, but he also knew that she was just at the beginning of that path. He had had years to process his hatred and his pain. For Adela, this was new, and although part of him wanted to despise her for her connection to her father, he also felt an unexpected compassion for her. "Your husband, is he involved too?" Amancio asked, his tone shifting to one more analytical, as if he were trying to piece things together. Adela hesitated, but finally nodded. "He's been working with my father on several business deals. I don't know all the details, but I know there are shady things in what they do. I never wanted to know more." Amancio leaned back in his seat, processing the information. The circle of corruption and betrayal didn't just involve his father, but now it also reached Adela's husband. This wasn't just a tragic coincidence. It was a cycle of injustice that had to be broken. "Adela," he said in a firm but not harsh voice, "you have a choice. You can keep ignoring what you know, living in that bubble, or you can do something about it. I've been fighting for years to dismantle what your father built, to clean up his legacy of lies. But I can't do it alone." Adela looked at him, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. "What do you mean?" "I want you to help me," Amancio replied, his voice loaded with conviction. "I want you to help me bring down the corrupt empire your father and husband have built. If you really want to stop being part of that lie, then join me." The plane continued its path through the sky, but for Adela, everything was at a tipping point. In front of her, an abyss of possibilities opened, and she had to decide whether to jump or step back. She knew what Amancio was proposing was dangerous, but she also knew that the truth, though painful, was the only path to redemption. "Are you willing to face the truth?" Amancio asked, looking her directly in the eyes. Adela, with her heart pounding in her chest, knew her life would never be the same again. And in that moment, she decided that she didn't want it to be. No more lies. No more shadows. "Yes," she finally replied, her voice firm. "I'm willing." And with that word, she sealed a pact that would change the course of their lives forever. The plane moved in silence, but Adela's heart beat strongly, as if each beat were a hammer on her conscience. She was still processing the pact she had just made with Amancio. She had said the word, yes, a small response, but one that marked the beginning of a radical change in her life. No more lies. No more living in the shadows of her father's and husband's actions. She leaned back in her seat, glancing at Amancio. He had returned to focusing on his tablet, but the intensity in his eyes hadn't diminished. Both of them knew that what came next wouldn't be easy, but somehow, the idea of working together on this, of dismantling a corrupt legacy, gave Adela a sense of purpose she had never felt before. Amancio broke the silence after a few minutes. "We need to be smart about this, Adela. You can't just go and confront your husband or your family without a plan. It could be dangerous. and we need to be prepared for what comes next." Adela looked at him, knowing he was right. Although she had made the decision to fight for the truth, the implications were overwhelming. She knew her husband, Manuel, wouldn't be easy to confront. He had been involved in her father's shady dealings for years, and although she had turned a blind eye, deep down, she had always known something dark was brewing. "Where do we start?" she finally asked, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. Amancio looked directly into her eyes, as if measuring her determination. "First, you need to be completely sure this is what you want to do. There's no going back once we start. This goes beyond just revealing a family secret. We're talking about destroying the empire your father and husband have built. And there are a lot of powerful people involved." Adela swallowed hard. She knew this wasn't just a matter of personal justice. What was at stake was much bigger than she had imagined. But she had come too far to turn back now. "I know," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. "I'm willing to do it. I can't keep living with ignorance as a shield." Amancio nodded, and for the first time since they had started this conversation, a spark of respect shone in his eyes. "Good. Then the first thing we need is information. There are documents, bank accounts, agreements your husband has signed. We need evidence. Something that can dismantle his web of corruption." Adela took a deep breath, trying to process what Amancio was asking. She knew Manuel kept important documents in his office at home, but she had never had the courage to look beyond the surface. This was her chance to do something. "He has an office at home," she said slowly. "He keeps work-related documents there. I could try to get in when he's not there. Find something that might be useful." Amancio looked at her intensely. "That's a good start, but you have to be extremely careful. Manuel isn't a stupid man, and if he suspects you're investigating, he won't hesitate to protect himself, no matter the cost." Adela felt a knot in her stomach. She knew Manuel was capable of many things, but she had never seen him as a direct threat to her. However, Amancio's words made her realize just how vulnerable she really was. "I'll do it," she said, although the idea of secretly confronting her husband sent chills down her spine. Amancio, observing her expression of uncertainty, softened his tone. "Adela, you're not alone in this. I'm here to help you. We both have reasons to want to see the end of this corrupt empire. If at any point you feel it's too much, let me know. But you need to know that any hesitation could put everything in danger." Adela nodded, appreciating the clarity and firmness of his words. She knew she couldn't afford to waver. This was the time to be strong, even if she didn't feel completely ready. The plane began its descent, and the cabin filled with the soft vibration of the imminent landing. Adela looked out the window, seeing the city they were heading to take shape beneath the clouds. The next chapter of her life was about to begin. When the plane touched down, Amancio turned to her once more. "I'll be in touch with you. We need to keep things discreet. No one can know we're working together." Adela nodded. She knew discretion was crucial. "I know. I'll do whatever it takes." Amancio gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I know." As they exited the plane, both went their separate ways, but they knew they were united by a common goal. Adela, while heading to collect her luggage, felt a mixture of overwhelming emotions: fear, anticipation, and a new sense of power she had never experienced before. That same night, Adela arrived home, a majestic mansion located on the outskirts of the city. As she entered, the echo of her steps resonated through the grand marble hallways, and the luxurious atmosphere that once gave her security now felt suffocating, as if the walls knew something was about to change. Manuel was not home, giving Adela the opportunity she needed. She headed to her husband's office, a room she had always avoided out of a mix of respect and fear. She knew what she was about to do was dangerous, but she also knew she could no longer be complicit in the lies. When she opened the office door, A mix of adrenaline and nerves flooded her. The room was large, decorated with dark, heavy furniture, and the walls were lined with shelves full of books. But Adela wasn't there to read. Her gaze immediately shifted to Manuel's desk, where she knew he kept his most important documents. With trembling hands, she began to search through the drawers. She found papers on investments, business deals, but nothing that seemed directly incriminating. Just as she was about to give up, she found a file marked with the name of a company she didn't recognize. When she opened it, her heart skipped a beat. Inside were contracts signed by her father and her husband, related to overseas deals that looked suspicious. The amounts of money being moved in these documents were astronomical. As she read, the feeling of betrayal hit her like a wave. Her husband wasn't just involved in shady business. He was deeply entangled in the same swamp of corruption as her father. The two men who had controlled her life for so long were partners in a rotten empire. With the file in hand, Adela felt something inside her harden. There was no turning back now. Adela remained in the office, the file in her hands, unable to move. The silence of the mansion seemed to come alive around her, wrapping her in a sense of isolation she had never felt before. She looked at the incriminating documents she had found, and the reality of what they meant began to settle in her consciousness. Her father and her husband, the two figures who had shaped her life, weren't just businessmen or influential politicians. They were architects of a corrupt system that had destroyed lives. And she, for years, had been complicit, though passively, blinded by the comfort and luxury they had offered her. With a trembling sigh, Adela closed the file and carefully placed it in her bag. She knew she had to share this information with Amancio, but more than that, she had to decide how to confront Manuel. Could she really face the man with whom she had shared her life, with whom she had built an appearance of stability? And how would he react if he found out she had begun to investigate? The echo of the front door reverberated through the mansion. Adela felt her stomach clench. Manuel had arrived. She quickly closed the desk drawer and hurried out of the office before he could see her there. She walked briskly toward the living room, trying to compose herself, though her heart pounded in her chest. Manuel greeted her with his usual confident smile when he saw her. He was a tall man, with an imposing presence and a sharp gaze, used to having control in every situation. "How was your trip?" Manuel asked as he hung his jacket on the marble coat rack. His tone was casual, as if nothing had changed, as if the same lies that had sustained their marriage were still intact. Adela tried to smile, though her mind was in chaos. "Good. It was exhausting, but productive," she replied, with a lightness she didn't feel. Manuel walked over to her and kissed her cheek, his usual gesture after returning from a long day at work. Adela felt the touch as distant, almost cold. She could no longer see Manuel the same way, knowing what she knew now. "I'm glad to hear that. I was thinking we could have dinner together tonight. We haven't had much time for ourselves lately," he said, with a smile that, in other circumstances, would have been charming, but now seemed like a mask. Adela nodded, her mind trying to find an escape, a plan. "Yes, of course. I'd like that." Manuel, satisfied with her response, headed to the kitchen to speak with the staff. Adela watched him walk away, wondering how a man could be so unaware of the devastation he was causing. That night, they would dine together as usual, but something in their relationship had irreversibly changed. Adela knew she was now playing a role, another facade in a marriage built on secrets. Later that night, when Manuel retired early to his office to make some calls, Adela took the opportunity to call Amancio from her bedroom. She locked the door, as if that could protect what she was about to discuss. The phone rang a couple of times before Amancio answered. His voice, as always, was firm and calm, but this time Adela detected a slight impatience. "Did you find it?" he asked bluntly. Adela took a deep breath. Yes. I found some documents in his office. They're signed by him and my father. I don't know if they're enough, but they're definitely proof that they're involved in corrupt business. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Then, Amancio spoke, calmer this time. That's a good start. We need to analyze those documents carefully. If they are what I think, they could be the first piece in dismantling their network. Adela nodded, though she knew Amancio couldn't see her. But what do we do now? I don't know how to confront him, Amancio. I'm afraid of what he might do if he finds out I know everything. Amancio sighed on the other end of the phone. I understand. Manuel isn't someone who can afford to lose. But you don't have to face him directly yet. First, we need to make sure we have everything we need. We can't rush this. Adela felt a mix of relief and frustration. She wanted to resolve everything immediately, but she knew he was right. Things couldn't be done impulsively. I know, she said quietly. It's just, this is harder than I thought. Amancio, for the first time since they had started talking, softened his tone. Adela, you're not alone in this. I'm here to help you, and we won't let Manuel or your father get away with it. But we need patience. Adela closed her eyes, nodding to herself. All right, I'll do whatever it takes. We'll meet soon. Stay alert. No one should suspect anything, Amancio added before saying goodbye. When she hung up, Adela lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Emotions swirled inside her. The fear of what was to come, the sadness over the truth she had uncovered, and the growing determination to see this through to the end. The next day, as Manuel left early for a meeting, Adela stayed home. The hours passed slowly as she mentally reviewed everything she had discovered, every conversation she had had with Amancio. She knew that at any moment, something could go wrong, but she was determined to continue. By mid-afternoon, she received a message from Amancio. Just a few words, but clear enough to understand that something was in motion. Meeting tonight. I'll tell you where. Adela felt a knot in her stomach. This was the start of real action. She knew she couldn't turn back. That night, when Manuel returned, she would have to make sure he didn't suspect anything. Everything had to seem normal. Hours later, as the sun began to fade, Adela found herself at a discreet restaurant on the outskirts of the city. Amancio was already there, sitting at a secluded table, his gaze fixed on her as she walked in. Despite what was at stake, there was a strange calm in the air, as if both knew this was the first step of something big. Adela sat across from him, and without needing any more words, she pulled out the documents she had found in Manuel's office. Amancio reviewed them in silence, turning the pages with the concentration of someone solving a puzzle. This is more than I expected, he finally said, his voice low but filled with intensity. With this, we can start building a real case. Not just against Manuel, but the entire network. Adela looked at him, feeling a small spark of hope grow inside her. For the first time in days, she felt that maybe, just maybe, they could win this battle. But she also knew that the most dangerous part was yet to come. And now what? She asked. Amancio looked up, his eyes fixed on hers, serious but filled with determination. Now we start dismantling them, piece by piece. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, Adela was ready to face it. That night, as Adela returned home after her meeting with Amancio, the city lights blurred through the taxi window. She felt as if she were living in a suspense movie, but she knew this wasn't fiction. This was her life, and it was dangerously intertwined with secrets and lies. She reminded herself that she couldn't turn back now. She was committed, and every step she took brought her closer to the truth, but it also exposed her to more risks. When the taxi stopped in front of her house, Adela got out with a feeling of unease in her stomach. It was late, and Manuel should already be asleep, but even so, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence surrounding the mansion seemed too thick, as if the darkness hid more than just shadows. She entered the house and, with quiet steps, made her way to the bedroom. Upon opening the door, she realized that Manuel wasn't there. A cold emptiness filled her chest. She looked around, trying to find some sign of him, but the only sound she could hear was the echo of her own breathing. She decided to go to Manuel's office. As she approached, she heard low voices, as if he were in the middle of a phone conversation. With her heart pounding, she stopped in front of the slightly open door. Peeking inside, she saw him. Manuel was sitting behind his desk, talking on the phone with a grim expression. His voice was low, tense, and although Adela couldn't hear all the words, the few she caught made fear take hold of her. "We can't let this get out of control. If anyone else finds out, I'm finished." "We're already running out of time," Manuel said urgently. Then, after a pause, he added, "If necessary, we'll take drastic measures." Adela felt her body tense. What was Manuel talking about? What did he mean by drastic measures? She knew she was venturing into dangerous territory, and what she was overhearing wasn't just a simple business matter. It was something darker, deeper, and clearly related to the secrets he and her father had kept for so long. She slowly backed away, trying not to make any noise, and headed back to the bedroom. Her mind was racing. What should she do? Should she confront Manuel now? She knew that could put her in danger. Amancio was right. Any misstep, and everything would fall apart. She sat on the bed, trying to calm herself. She knew she had to be cautious, but she also knew that time was running out. Manuel was getting closer to discovering that someone was investigating him, and Adela feared that when he did, she would be caught in the storm. The next morning, Manuel seemed different. Colder, more distant. During breakfast, he barely looked at her, and the few times he spoke, it was in a cutting tone that unsettled her. Adela tried to maintain an appearance of normalcy, but the tension in the air was palpable. "I'll have to leave the city for a few days," Manuel suddenly said, placing his coffee cup on the table with a sharp thud. "Business matters." Adela nodded, though inside she was nervous. She knew this business trip could be related to what she had overheard the night before. "When are you leaving?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "This afternoon," Manuel replied without looking at her. "I won't be gone long, but I need everything to be under control while I'm away. I trust you'll keep yourself busy with your own things." The coldness in his words cut through her like a knife. Manuel had never been an especially warm husband, but there was something in his tone that scared her, as if he no longer cared about maintaining appearances with her. Later, when Manuel finally left, Adela felt a momentary relief, though the feeling of danger didn't leave her. She took advantage of his absence to talk to Amancio, telling him everything she had overheard the night before. "Manuel is more nervous than I thought," Adela said on the phone, pacing back and forth in the living room. "I overheard part of a conversation. He's worried someone might find out what he's doing." Amancio remained silent for a moment, processing the information. Then, his voice came through serious but calm. "That means we're close. But it also means things are about to get more dangerous. If Manuel feels cornered, he could react in unpredictable ways." Adela knew this. Every time Manuel lost control of a situation, his response was always swift and harsh. She had seen that side of him in business, though she had never thought it could one day be directed at her. "We need something more concrete to take him down. The documents you found are a good start, but we need a direct connection to his most recent operations. If we can expose his illegal dealings abroad, it'll be much harder for him to get away with it." Adela nodded, though she felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. "Okay, but what if he finds out before we can act?" Sensing her fear, Amancio tried to reassure her. "He won't. Stay strong. I'm working on my own plan to pressure key people in his circle." But you need to be careful. If you suspect anything, get out." Adela gripped the phone tighter. She knew Amancio was playing a dangerous game, one that involved both their lives. And now, her loyalty to him had become more than just a strategic alliance. She felt she had found in Amancio someone who understood the pain and weight of the past, someone who sought not only justice but also redemption. "I will. I'll keep my eyes open," she responded, trying to sound braver than she felt at that moment. That night, the mansion felt emptier than ever. Adela sat in the living room, staring at the shadows cast on the walls. She thought about how her life had changed in such a short time. Just weeks ago, she would have spent the evening quietly reading a book or watching a movie without a care about what was happening around her. But now, she was at the center of a whirlwind of betrayals, corruption, and truths that threatened to destroy everything she had ever known. Suddenly, the sound of a message on her phone startled her. She grabbed it quickly and saw it was from Amancio. "Something is happening. Stay alert. I'll see you tomorrow." The message was short, but clear enough to tighten the knot in her stomach. She knew time was running out. The pieces were falling into place, but could they really dismantle everything before Manuel and her father found out? Adela turned off the phone and looked around the mansion. Everything in her life, her world of wealth and privilege, now felt like a prison. And the only way to escape was to face the lies, no matter how painful they were. She knew the hardest part was yet to come. Adela didn't sleep well that night. Her mind kept replaying Amancio's message. Something is happening. She knew what was coming would be decisive, that the threads of corruption entangling her life were about to snap. She had come too far to turn back, but the fear consumed her. What would Manuel do when he found out she was betraying him? The next morning, she received a message from Amancio with the location where they would meet. It was a small cafe in a discreet part of the city. Adela left early, making sure not to leave any traces of her departure. The nervousness in her stomach grew with every step toward the meeting. When she arrived at the cafe, Amancio was already there, sitting at a secluded table, his expression serious as usual. When Adela sat down, he gestured for her to come closer. This was no time for small talk. "We have a chance," Amancio said in a low voice. "My contacts have gained access to secret bank accounts. There are records of transfers that directly implicate Manuel and your father. It's enough to expose them, but we need to move quickly. Manuel might be more alert than we think." Adela looked at him, feeling the weight of what she was about to do. There was no turning back. This was her only chance to dismantle the corrupt empire that had ruled her life. But she also knew that doing so meant risking everything. Her life, her safety, her future. "What do I need to do?" she asked, a mix of determination and fear in her voice. Amancio studied her carefully. "I need you to access Manuel's accounts from his computer. If we can access his personal records, that will give us the final piece we need to take him down. I'll handle the rest." "But, Adela, this isn't easy. If he finds out—" "I know," she interrupted, fully aware of what was at stake. "I'll do whatever it takes." Amancio nodded, respecting her courage. "I'll be watching over you. You won't be alone." That night, Adela returned home. The silence of the mansion greeted her once again, but this time it didn't bring the same fear. Instead of feeling the oppression of the lies surrounding her, she felt something different: power. She knew what she had to do, and she knew she was closer than ever to taking down her father and her husband's empire. With calculated steps, she headed to Manuel's office. She knew he wasn't home. He had left for one of his last-minute meetings. She sat in front of her husband's computer, trembling but determined. She entered his password, one she had memorized at some point, never thinking the day would come when she would use it to destroy him. What she found was worse than she imagined. Documents, transfers, names she didn't recognize but knew were involved in a network of corruption and crime. Everything was there, out in the open. Her father and Manuel had built their fortune on a foundation of lies, betrayals, and ruined lives. Adela felt the weight of what she was discovering crush her, but it also gave her renewed strength. With every file she copied, with every piece of evidence she saved, she felt like she was taking control of her life, finally breaking free from the chains that had bound her for so long. Suddenly, the sound of the front door stopped her cold. Manuel had returned. Her heart began to race, but she knew she couldn't show fear. She carefully closed the computer and left the office, trying to appear casual. When Manuel entered the house, he greeted her briefly, without suspicion. Adela watched him, feeling a mix of emotions. This man, with whom she had shared her life, was now someone she no longer recognized. But it wasn't just about him. It was the world she had lived in, the one that now needed to crumble. "How was the meeting?" Adela asked, with a calm she didn't know she could control. "Fine," Manuel responded, but his tone was distant, as if he were thinking about something else. "I have to work on a few things. Don't stay up waiting for me." Adela nodded, though she already knew this would be the last time Manuel could give her such an order. The night was falling, and with it, the weight of the decisions she had made. The next morning, everything was ready. Amancio had arranged for the documents to be handed over to the authorities. Manuel's and his father's network was about to be exposed. Adela knew it wouldn't be an easy path, but she felt an inner peace she hadn't felt in years. When the news began to spread, Manuel reacted with fury. She watched him on the TV, his face tense and his eyes wide. He realized that someone had betrayed him, but he didn't know who. Adela observed him from the other side of the room, feeling that, for the first time in a long time, the control was no longer in his hands, but hers. "This can't be happening," Manuel muttered in disbelief as reports of the criminal investigation spread across the media. He knew his life, as he knew it, was about to crumble. "How could this happen?" he asked, more to himself than to Adela. She watched him in silence, her hands trembling slightly, but with a serenity in her heart. She knew that what came next would be the beginning of her freedom. Days later, as Manuel was being arrested, Adela found herself in a city park, sitting on a bench with Amancio. The soft evening breeze wrapped around them as they both stared at the horizon in silence. They had achieved the impossible, bringing down an empire of lies, and in the process, both had changed forever. "We did it," Amancio said softly, breaking the silence. Adela looked at him, with a soft and sincere smile on her lips. "Yes, we did. And now, what's next?" Amancio looked at her with a more relaxed expression, though still with the shadow of the past in his eyes. "That depends on you. You faced more than many people could endure, but there's still so much ahead. What do you want to do?" Adela took a deep breath, feeling that, for the first time in her life, the decision was entirely hers. "I want to rebuild. I want to help the people who were hurt by this. And I want to live a life without lies." Amancio nodded, with a smile that reflected the satisfaction of having found in her not just an ally, but someone who shared his desire for justice and redemption. The sun was slowly setting on the horizon, painting the sky in warm tones. Adela felt that a new chapter in her life was beginning, one where she would be in control of her destiny. As the two of them rose from the bench and began walking toward the future, Adela knew that, although the journey had been difficult, the end had allowed her to find a peace she had never imagined. And so, as the story of Adela and Amancio closed, a new story was beginning to take shape, a future full of possibilities, but without the shadows of the past that had once bound them. What did you think of this story? Tell us in the comments. What would you do in a similar situation? We invite you to like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your friends or family as a show of support. This motivates us to keep posting exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next surprising narrative that's about to appear on your screen. We truly value having you here with us, and you can click on the links appearing on your screen right now. We have an exclusive selection of captivating stories and guaranteed entertainment just for you. See you in the next video. Take care.